Hey everyone. Today I have Bruce Alderman here for some conversation. Bruce is an affiliate faculty at John F. Kennedy University in the Consciousness and Transformative Studies and Holistic Counseling Psychology departments. He's also co host and founder of the Integral Stage podcast, the premier forum for in depth conversations and explorations of integral theory and metamodern spirituality. At least that's how I would characterize it. Good stuff happening over there, really fascinating stuff. And I mean, many other things could be said, but by way of introduction, I'll just throw those couple things out there. I discovered your stuff through the Integral Stage and through all your work in that context. But since then have just been, really super impressed and blown away by the depth and the insight, the breadth of all of your various fields of interest and exploration. And yeah, thought it would be great to have some conversation. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Well, I first encountering you online, I felt I was, with a kindred spirit. I immediately resonated with what you were doing in your project and your way of presenting things and your kinds of inquiry. So I'm really glad to have this conversation and to be circling more and more in your metamodern spirituality community, as well as doing my integral post-metaphysical and other things.
Yeah, so that's a great kind of maybe way into some of this because I'd say a little bit about your background with this whole space. I mean, some people are kind of calling it the meta space. There's sort of, a recognized overlap between integral folks and metamodernists and so, yeah, I mean, you've got a very rich background with all of this and have been doing some really, really in-depth work for a while. And so talk a little bit about that background a little bit and how you would maybe sort of situate yourself in the metamodernism scene as all this stuff relates to itself.
Sure. Should I maybe do a little kind of the spiritual background that kind of led up to all
Yeah,
of it?
yeah, by all means.
Yeah. I think it probably my spiritual search began in earnest in high school. I was raised in a nominally religious family. We went to church, but it was mostly because my dad liked the brass band that they had, and he played the cornet, and so it
Mm-hmm.
was a great place for him to practice his music more than there being a really deep interest in spirituality there. But there were a number of crises and losses and things that happened in high school that propelled me to really reflect on life and purpose and just larger questions, and feeling some aspects of my own identity getting cracked and shaken pretty significantly during that period. And uh, I probably I had a propensity to sometimes shift into altered states and things, and I was a dreamy kind of creative writing and artistic person. So that was always with me, but it didn't have a spiritual flavor to it in my mind at that time. Um, a friend of mine, his mother sent me on a retreat. I've told this story elsewhere, so I won't dwell on it, but I was able to escape from the kind of oppressive atmosphere of the different things that had gone wrong in my town and spend time up in the California mountains, and had something of a spiritual encounter up there with the mountain's presence. And at the time, with my background, I interpreted it as God, and uh, different things happened. I decided to embrace Christianity in earnest at that point. And it sent me on a long search. But because of that experience, that was primarily a mystically oriented, experientially oriented Christianity. And it was really hard for me to find that in the communities where I was living, especially in Tomball, Texas, where you just aren't going to find that kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing there. And I did seek out um, different, teachers and priests and other individuals, but most of them kind of shooed me away from, looking too deeply at the at the mystical aspects of religion. And so it was not very satisfying, and it became more inwardly focused in terms of my own process. And I discovered, I think, Thomas Merton's work and some other.
And how old were you at this point?
Probably 18, 17.
Yeah.
I think at 17, I was reading Thomas Aquinas, and I remember writing in my journal that God, I'm going to turn my back on you in order to find you. Inspired by.
Not yet. That's great. Okay.
So that was my thought, is that I wasn't finding God in a living form in any of the churches or teachers around me. So it pushed more in a contemplative direction. But the deeper I went into that, especially with Thomas Merton's work and reading his, Asian journals and some of his other essays on Suzuki and on Sufism and things like that, it really began to open me up towards spirituality in general. I'd been interested in creative writing, and I used to investigate Norse mythology and things like that as just kind of a fun fantasy thing, and had attempted to create my own worlds and religions and mythologies out of an interest in fantasy. And so that began to actually get more weight to it, and to really think about, okay, there's something here, and we're not being, in my community, in my family, even though my parents were sensitive and good people and spiritual in some way, but I wasn't really being nourished in that environment. So it began to open out towards a broader interest in world religions, not just Christianity or Catholicism, or more contemplatively oriented Episcopal. That was kind of my background. I think at some point I was applying to become a monk. I inquired a couple places, but it didn't really seem to fall into place for me. And I discovered Krishnamurti's work maybe in my early 20s, and began to really dive into his work. Different things happened. My mother and I I had to drop out of school. We became essentially homeless. We went out to the Arizona wilderness and decided to begin again. She lost her business, she lost her house. I had to drop out of college. And so we just took off to the wilderness and used it as a contemplative time. I brought Krishnamurti's books and other spiritual books. We lived in the forest, and I spent a lot of time up in the canyons and meditating and praying and playing music and reading spiritual texts. Eventually we had to look for work. We had to survive. And yeah, so following that, I think, I'm in the danger of falling into like my whole life narrative.
Well, no, wait, let me ask you a quick. So at that period, what would you have sort of identified as, in terms of like, was there a hippie-ish like Dharma bums component? Was there just a spiritual seeker? Was there, would you have said that you're a Christian contemplative? How would you have like put that into a label or words of some kind?
It was hard to name exactly. I was long-haired, so people did identify me as hippie-ish, but I didn't use drugs or drink alcohol or anything like that. And so in that way, I was trying to be monk-like and live a prayer-focused and contemplation-focused life. I think I had, for a while, I had still an interest in being a Christian contemplative, and I considered myself that for a long time, though Krishnamurti was working on me in a way subtly to find modes of inquiry that didn't need to plug into any particular lineage and still reach for spiritual depth. And so that was happening. I was in a rock band at the time, and they used to call me the monk in the rock band because I wasn't drinking or using drugs. It was everyone else in the band was pretty wild. But yeah, once I was, in the wilderness, I think I had really begun to let go of a strong Christian identity and was just opening up into more explorations. Uh, I've recounted it in one of the videos on the integral stage, but there was a 4-night kind of initiatory period that happened to me while I was living out in the wilderness. It was like a progressive 4-night sequence of all-night visionary, lucid type experiences that were, really, I imagine, of the intensity of a DMT trip or something like that, but it was just, spontaneously arising for me. And those were pretty powerful for me. And I think they let me know that, there was something else to do with my life. There was a, kind of a message communicated with them that I've been really kind of wrestling with my whole life. And, things settled into just regular routine of working, but in that area of Arizona, but I maintained the contemplation. I finally got a call to possibly go to Asia and work. And so I went up into the wilderness again and did a several-day vision quest up there, and came away from that thinking, yes, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go to Asia. And so I did it. And I went over to Asia, and I taught for a few years in Korea and studied Sun Buddhism and music while working, and saved a lot of money, and then used that to go over to Indonesia for a year. And first I was in Bali and studying mostly music and not doing much contemplation except on my own. But then I went to Java, and I found an ashram there that they said ashram, but it was more Buddhist focused than Hindu focused. And they really practiced a kind of Javanese Theravada mindfulness practice. So the arrangement there was, you can live there for free if you agree to attend the Vipassana meditations and teachings every night. And so I did that. And they had a big spiritual library, and I studied music at a local college and attended the meditations every night. And that was a wonderful year. And occasionally he would encourage me to go deeper. So sometimes I would go over to Malaysia, Penang Island, for intensive 10-day or 30-day Vipassana retreats.
Wow.
And Mahasi Sayadaw tradition. And those were, again, rich, ripening kinds of experiences.
Had you had any kind of experience up till then with Buddhist meditation, or was that your introduction to it?
I'd done a little experimentation with it in Korea, but not intensively because I was pretty busy working. But I went to some temples and got a little instruction, but it wasn't really a regular practice until I went to Java. And then it just really rooted into a regular practice. And one of the things I discovered was how armored my body was after the traumas I'd gone through. And then actually living in Korea, where I was basically a spectacle everywhere I went. I was either treated as a celebrity or a pariah. And there was no balance typically of finding an atmosphere where I could be just a human being in most contexts. There were some good friends, but outside in public, it was one or the other. Because of my long hair, sometimes more than once, I was stopped on the beach and Koreans gathered around me and treated me like Jesus and sang hymns to me.
Oh, wow. Wow. Did you have to resist the urge to start a Korean cult then, or did that not come up for you?
Didn't come up for me. But
that's probably good.
Yeah, it was funny though. But it was part of the whole weird spectacle of not being a human, right? And so when I left there and I went to Indonesia, where it was much more relaxed in terms of how people regarded you, it was in partly a developing a contemplation practice and partly a healing practice. I really found going through the full body, mindfulness practices where the energy wasn't flowing, where the armor was, and a year-long process of really working on that and thawing that. And I was exposed at the time to Tantra, but it seemed too outlandish and complex to me. The person who lived next to me in the ashram had an altar set up and did regular chants and pujas and things like that. And it just seemed, especially from Krishnamurti, who's kind of like a Protestant mystic, where he wants to strip down all the forms and just focus on the relationship to consciousness and mind, and so it was hard for me to digest that. But I felt a call to India, and eventually I did go there, and got a job at a Krishnamurti school in India teaching creative writing. And I was able to live there for a year, doing basically meditation and dialogue every day. Again, they had a wonderful library, and I taught a few classes.
And how old were you by about this point?
I think I was my late 20s.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think I was late 20s by that point. And when I talked to you about just today about having that kind of decentered experience, it happened at the Krishnamurti Center for me. In a way, it was partly, I think, a fruit of all that Vipassana meditation, but then there was a different kind of, I think it still was a kind of Vipassana practice in terms of just watching the movement of thought, and tuning into the awareness between thoughts. And that was the kind of the primary mode of inquiry at that time. And it took, it opened up into multiple different kinds of experiences. There was a visionary experience at that time where I dreamed that a Tibetan, I woke up in my, every now and then a Tibetan monk who actually was one of the, I don't know his exact title, but he was basically the leader, the secular leader of Tibet in exile. And he would come to the school every now and then. And so I met him. So I had a little bit of exposure to Tibetan teachings, but not much. But I had this kind of visionary dream experience of, waking up and there was a lama standing in the room. And, it was an intense experience that took me through a dying process in the dream and opened up into, kind of a formless awareness and then eventual reconstitution of the body. And at that point, I felt something happened here, and I began to kind of dig more deeply into Tibetan tradition. And that eventually led me up to Nepal, where I met some Bon and Buddhist Dzogchen teachers and started a relationship with them that then lasted, many years. Eventually, I left Asia and I came back to the United States and lived for several years at a Tibetan Lama's house in Virginia and helped him open up a retreat center and run a newsletter, a Buddhist or a Bon and Buddhist newsletter. Did a lot of intensive retreats with him. All of that, I think this is now I'm approaching with that background. Now I'm approaching why I'm in this kind of meta-community situation, which is that all of that experience from multiple traditions made me hungry for a way to integrate these different streams and to dialogue in some way with the communities that had shown no recognition or valuation of those things. I'd been also a student in a Christian college and always struggled there. I had beautiful devotional experiences there and terrible contemplative or mystical ones. Nobody could get it, So I had this desire to integrate religion and contemplative tradition and psychology and other modes Um, and so from Virginia, I sought out some kind of degree program that I could go to, and that eventually brought me out to California and to the school where I'm now teaching. And I was able to do a transpersonal psychology degree there. And uh, that was for me the closest thing that I could find without entering seminary, but to follow a more secular integrative path where I could
Yeah.
draw on elements of the West and East
Mm-hmm.
for more fully developing, myself and finding a voice for communicating in a complex, diverse, intersecting world.
Yeah. That's fascinating. There's so many like points in your story that bring up a lot of overlap for me. Which is interesting, and we can probably get into that maybe briefly. But because I come from a Christian background, but I relate a lot to what you're speaking to in terms of like starting from a particular space and then sort of gaining a whole new sense of awareness of so many different traditions, and then what do you do with that? Which so I'm really interested. I'm interested because so much of what has seemed to come in the latter part of that is deep kind of rooting in these Eastern traditions, and having come from a Western tradition, how do you, I don't know, reflect on that a little bit? Like how have you kind of integrated that in terms of is there, Joseph Campbell has this idea that there are these certain kinds of like, there's the transcendent thing, but then it gets locally realized in different religious concepts. And I suppose there are all sorts of ways that you can kind of conceptualize the differences, but also the sameness. And yeah, so how do you take the whole span of your experience and find some, coherent thread, if there is one to be found?
Right. I was inspired, of course, as I mentioned, by Thomas Merton and Bede Griffiths and a few other people who were attempting not only East-West dialogue, but in some ways practicing across boundaries, and while remaining true to their traditions. Raimon Panikar and a number of folks, Abhishektananda, number of folks who were doing this kind of thing. And so I was interested in that. And I found, again, I kind of rediscovered Wilber's work. And that seemed to bring together a lot of threads for me. He provided a framework for me to begin to think about how, along the spectrum of consciousness and in other dimensions of Aquil, how the different traditions can be seen to be interrelated. And I think I've probably moved through several different orientations. Initially, I think I probably had what you'd call a perennialist point of view, which is the one that you mentioned, that basically there is this transcendent reality and everybody accesses it in their own way, but it's the same transcendent reality, and that each is valid. And I felt like Vatican II and some things had taken at least some steps in that kind of recognition. I think they still tended towards a kind of inclusivism. Ultimately, Catholicism is the ultimate revelation, but others participate in that. And I think I maybe held a similar view. I was looking at, some Buddhist or Wilber's articulation as probably the peak of that, and others as participating in it to various degrees. But there was something about it that I didn't feel quite comfortable with, and that basically came out of genuine dialogue with others, and others escaping any kind of categories that I would necessarily put them in as belonging to this stage or that stage, or the limitations, so I didn't want to, to me, it didn't make sense to just be a kind of a chaotic pluralism where there's no kind of grounding. So I began looking and trying to articulate, what is an integrative pluralism that both allows for that diversity and yet honors the overlap and the connections and the interrelationships, and can allow for cross-community fecundation and communion and practice. So that's been an abiding interest. And I think the articulation of Wilbur back in 2006, 2007 of the outlines of integral post-metaphysical spirituality is kind of what really captured me as a promising path forward.
Yeah.
And I wasn't certain how I felt about all of his formulations, but I felt there was something there. So it
Yeah.
opened up a many-year inquiry for me.
I want to talk about post-metaphysical spirituality in a second, but first, a lot of the stuff you're talking about raises some questions that I feel like it'd be interesting to explore, because so one of the feelings that I've gotten, having been raised in kind of a Western Christian tradition and discovering a lot of these Eastern traditions, is that there's a very different emphasis, if you can even call it an emphasis, on a state training, state exploration, meditation, things like that, the going inward. And while, of course, in the Western tradition, you have a very rich and robust tradition of Christian mystics and contemplatives doing similar sorts of inner state exploration and cultivation, it's never really been kind of front and center. And that's what I mean by emphasis. And so it's very easy to go your whole life in a Christian context and never have like sat for 20 minutes and just examined your own mind working. And so that to me is a really interesting kind of, I don't know, it seems like for me a huge blind spot. And one of the things that Wilbur, in his articulation of this integrated framework, I mean, states are deeply important. And as I've been going, deeper and deeper into Wilbur and thinking more about that, I've just realized how much of that was lacking from the tradition that I came from. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that in terms of trying to do some kind of integrative East-Western, dialogue conversation, when in one tradition, that component seems to be a lot less, on the front burner.
It's a challenge, and especially where I grew up, and also the college that I went to, the idea that you would sit for a while and empty yourself is just an invitation for demons to enter. Right? So there's a pretty big hurdle there to even beginning a dialogue. And one of the things that I did, and not always in an exemplary fashion, is after I got back from Asia, I trolled Christian forums quite a lot. I used to dig and poke at different theological holes or gaps or things like that, or try to invert values, asking people, let's pray for the devil, things like that, just to see what would happen. And but I also went through a kind of a self-searching and I don't know what I would say except a self-recrimination around some of the antagonistic and belittling way I was relating back to Christianity, and recognize that wasn't healthy, that I felt wounded by aspects of it and disappointed in what seemed like big gaping holes in aspects of it. And I was taking it out, sometimes in a trolling way on different, forums and in groups. And I really recognized that wasn't healthy. And I made a practice of listening every day to fundamentalist radio for about 2 hours on my commute, and to just take it in until I wasn't reacting anymore. I turned it into a kind of Vipassana practice, but for me, it was also a heart practice of being able to receive where they were coming from and get beyond my triggers. And by the end of that, I did it for several years. By the end of it, I think I did come to a good place where I didn't agree theologically with the majority of where they stood, but I got to a place where I could feel their hearts, and I could see the values that they were invested in and reaching for in the shapes that they were doing that. And I think that was a helpful thing for me to get out of that kind of
Mhm.
polarized, reactive way of relating back to my home tradition.
Mhm.
And that then made the way for me, it made it more possible to begin to think about dialogue and integration and things like
Mhm.
that.
That's really interesting. I still I have to admit I still get very triggered by certain things. Um, just actually, I don't know, maybe 2 hours ago, I watched the trailer. There's a new video film coming out called "God's Not Dead, We the People," and it's sort of this Hollywood-esque version of like all the fundamentalist Christian grievances around feeling oppressed and the government's gonna make their kids not believe in and it's like, but it's all slick in Hollywood, like, trailer format. And it was just like, oh, gag, this is so hard. And I want to, there's some way that I want to kind of exercise that somehow. And actually, this is interesting too, because um I on the path to kind of doing that sort of work, I find that let me see if I can express this, because this is there needs to be a little nuance here, I think. And so let me try to see if I can articulate this. But one of a big element of the Wilbur framework and the integral framework, and also now kind of a metamodern framework, is a big component of that is stage recognition of developmental awareness, and recognizing how people are sort of engaging the world from a different set of lenses related to what stage they're at isn't a good way of putting that, but just that there are these different very um, different angles to look at the world. And that's been helpful as a framework to be able to situate some of this, right? Because then it's not just this purely kind of antagonistic, you have one worldview and I have another, and there's sort of, one's got to win or something. But it allows a kind of vantage of setting these things in sort of a broader, framework or a map that can hopefully work towards a greater appreciation of what all of these perspectives have to offer. But I have to say, for me, I'm still working very much on the work of trying to see how some of these perspectives are value providing, are significant and meaningful, and not something to just shut down, right? And so how would you address that? I mean, when you turn on the evangelical radio and you hear the kinds of stuff that you're talking about that you might not agree with, yes, you can eventually get to a point where you're not necessarily triggered in an emotional, resentful way. But also, what do you do with everything sort of in between, where I mean, yeah, how do you find a good peace with all that stuff that's out there, in a way that doesn't either grind on you, or that you don't also just want to affirm and just say, oh well, all's one, sort of. How do you do that?
It's not easy. Yeah, there's a good deal that I think is going on in the blending of nationalism and theism, and conspiracy, that to me looks pretty toxic for building a healthy culture. And I think I know people who are refugees from those environments, and they've been wounded by that experience. So definitely I don't want to give a wholesale green blanket yes to what's going on. I think there are pathologies, if you want to use that kind of language, but I think there are there are values that are recognizable, but the way that they're finding, recognizable and I think valid, but that the way that they're finding expression, or the narrow um, limits around, around that expression is causing harm. And I think, one of the things to do is, I think, to begin to articulate alternatives in a way and in a language that can reach
Yeah.
same communities, without, without necessarily having to take them on always directly and strengthen them, but in the Buckminster Fuller idea of providing a better alternative, right? Something that can speak to people and nourish them, and that can still allow them to feel good in their own identities. And so I think in our communities, we need to get better at that, in terms of,
Yeah.
if we want to be mesh workers, using a spiral dynamics word, if we want to be mesh workers in the culture, we've got to find ways to intersect with and navigate and communicate with these different communities. But also, I think, speak in a way that can address some of the core concerns and provide other ways forward. And I've definitely, in my teaching, I've encountered that in another area, which is more of people who are deeply into green and privately struggling with some incoherences or some moral inconsistencies and other things that they're experiencing within that context, but don't have a way out. So I've learned in my university, often I can't present Wilbur and integral straight up without it being rejected by certain segments of our school population as just white cisgender privileged male, same old
Right.
right. So yeah, it's been a dance of really trying to feel into what are the core concerns and what are the core issues
Yeah.
at the heart of their own green activist work.
I've been really interested in this issue a lot. And literally it's the first thing I think about when I wake up, and it's the last thing I go to bed thinking about, of how to sort of articulate ideas in ways that can be engaged with optimally, most effectively, from different people from these different perspectives. Because it's not all one. You can't just write, let's say, a book and think that it's going to, just land with every audience, right? Like, there's a real difference between, and I go back to myself, say, when I was 15, and I think, okay, enter, evangelical worldview mode, and like think about what I would feel if I now was saying the things that I was saying. And I know that if I say them in a certain way, they just won't, it'll just clash, right? There's certain barriers, and so, having that recognition that, and similarly, I could go through different stages of, me when I was, hyper, sort of reductive and empirical and kind of in that more orange mode, right? And then anything having to do with spirituality or spirit would have been anathema. So, there's enough of those experiences that I can draw from to be like, okay, what would the different me's need to hear in those different moments to be drawn into a real rich conversation that could start to genuinely expand, some awareness in the ways that that from my vantage now, I feel like that's what the me at that point might have benefited from. And to do that requires, of course, putting these ideas into a framework or into language, into forms that are most easily digestible to folks wherever they're at. But so much of that seems to be missing, and I'm really interested in seeing folks work very intentionally in the, and when I say folks, I mean, well, if no one's else, if there's not a lot of people doing it, then like, this is something that I very much want to do, but I don't know the best way to do it. Right. So like, what if, let me throw this by you. I mean, like, let's say you take some of the basic integral framework, and you were to sort of present it, maybe here it's presented in full, modernist, empirical, rationalist, data backed, footnoted, studies. But maybe here it's represented more mythologically, and it's sort of given, articulation that way, and sort of allow people to find it at the different, in the different forms that it might kind of take hold. I guess to turn that into a question, one, are you aware of any one or any set of literature or any set of anything that sort of is attempting to do that? And two, I mean, what are your thoughts on what would be the best way to go about doing that? And I'll take notes.
Well, there's a really innovative young man who writes under many pseudonyms and contemplated writing under the name of Hansi, but hasn't done it yet. So no, I think you are making good efforts in that direction. Yeah. So
well, thanks. But yeah. I mean, like, what would you say? I guess my question is like, what would you say needs to be done? What's missing from that project, right? I think we have a shared sense of like, okay, this is the project, but so then how would you go about it? Or what do you feel like is most in need in that space?
One of the things that I think people are hungry for is, a sense of meaningful togetherness and practice, communal, participatory spaces.
Mm-hmm.
I remember for me, what got me to go to the Christian college, even though I was in my mystical mindset, when I went to the introduction to the university, we sat in a large stadium, and at some point they turned out all of the lights, everybody held hands and sang soaring 4-part harmony devotional songs.
Mm-hmm.
And I was bawling my eyes out.
Yeah.
Even though I didn't fully accept, the package that was behind that, the spirit of that touched me so much. And I think, for me, being a person who's mostly focused on writing and the word, I've overlooked many times the power and the value of having those kinds of spaces where there's real human, encounter and shared communing around a set of values and insights that, in a way, I think almost the theological package behind it is secondary.
Yeah. No, it's so interesting because that's both the wonder and the brilliance and the genius of that. It's also can be the dark side, right? That's how some people can wind up in cults, right? They're like, but no, what you're talking about so resonates. When I landed ultimately at Yale Divinity School, I was just really, there would be chapel gatherings where, I'd come in, I'd sit in a pew and I'd be like, chapel, I'd have all my kind of negative baggage that I was bringing. And then, yeah, there'd be a beautiful choir. And then, like Christian Wyman would get up and read some beautiful thing he'd written. And then we'd sing again. And I was just like, oh my gosh, this is so beautiful. I can't not just fall into this. And so two things about that come up for me. One is that when you were talking to about how, like, the sort of the best thing that you could find for the kind of integrating paradigm, as like a program that you could do was this, what was it? Integral transpersonal psychology. What was your master's?
Yeah, it started out as transpersonal counseling psychology. And towards the end of my, career there, the school career, they developed an integral psychology program. So I
Cool.
stayed for an extra year
Oh,
and
nice.
got some courses in that as well.
But I guess my point being that it's very rare, and I experienced this a lot because before I found the integral community, it was very hard to find people who could talk about spirituality un I don't want to say unmoored or unrooted, but not sort of so parochially attached to the specific images and symbols of its tradition, right? And so, like, Yale Divinity School is a beautiful place where that sort of Christian activity can happen, but it was precisely because of that very specific imagery and a kind of lack of engagement with all the other traditions imagery. It felt limited to me, even as it's really spoke to me. And that as I've explored so many other areas, it's like, well, you might have, you know, basically your options are these divinity schools, which are some distinct form of Christianity, or there's, religious studies programs, which more or less tend to just be anthropology and aren't really particularly interested in spirituality at all. Or again, then there's a tradition specific Buddhist or Hindu or what have you. And yes, there's a smattering of ecumenical and interfaith dialogue things going on. But I guess my point is one, that just that kind of in-person community rooted sort of infrastructure for a trans tradition, interfaith and sort of trans faith spirituality it's very hard to find if it exists at all. And so, one, I feel like that's challenge one. Two is, as I've found elements of this community, it's such a diaspora. We're so separated. You're out in California. Most other people, in these communities, half of them are in Europe, right? And people in Colorado, and we're just all sort of scattered. And so the idea of doing some kind of in-person engagement seems really hard, as diligently as I'm trying to work to organize and facilitate those sorts of things, having a space now. So I guess, again, to kind of put that into a question, what do we do about that? How do we create that sort of container that you're talking about that isn't just theologically narrative driven, but is actually participatory and in person and energetic, connecting when we're so disconnected and when those infrastructures aren't in place?
It's a great question, and there are a couple things I could say about it, but maybe the main thing is a project that I started about 10 years ago with with a student of mine. And now it's languishing. We're not doing much on it, especially because we're working on the integral stage, but it's something that eventually I invited laymen into, and it's called the Foundation for Integral Religion and Spirituality. But here's what we developed, and actually we did it in conjunction with Ken Wilber and some other people. The basic idea was to create a coordination program where anyone interested from any faith background could attend a central program where they would learn basically integrative vision logic, spiral dynamics, and other kinds of frames that could be applied and unpacked in different ways for their spiritual tradition. And we partnered with an interfaith ordination board in New York and got the agreement with them that basically through their umbrella organization, we would be able to confer an integral spirituality ordination.
Oh,
we
cool.
weren't aiming only at people who we wanted to aim first at people who were already ordained, so that this could be a co-ordination.
Yeah.
But the ultimate or the longer term thing was to make it into something that it could stand alone. As it's kind of like, we have like a program in Berkeley, California, where you can become an interfaith minister. And there's another program like that in New York that I know of, and there's several around. But we really felt like the impact would be stronger if you're not just creating kind of another set aside, a set apart tribalized group of now there's integral people, it's better to have that way of looking, that sensibility take root and flower uniquely within different traditions. And so that was the vision. We were cooperating with one university, developed a full curriculum,
Wow.
which again, Ken Wilber reviewed and approved.
I'd love to see this. This is fascinating. Especially the curriculum. Like, I'd love to know what that looks like.
Okay. Yeah, the long-term vision that we were holding at that point, I was meeting with number of people, Dustin DePerna and other people, kind of planning this out at the time. Long-term vision for that was we envisioned a multi-faith seminary, that it would be a campus where people could specialize in one direction or another, but it would be an interdisciplinary thing where there would be steady generative encounters among different faith communities, using some things like the deep dialogue process and some other tools that are already out there that could be used to both help people develop robustly within their own traditions if they wanted to, but begin part of this interspiritual movement that Teasdale or Johnson and Ord or other people are talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so that was the long-term thing. We have a website that is not published. We've got some stuff that we've been collecting there, and Layman and I eventually want to begin rolling with it again, but we're kind of focusing on the stage for right now.
Yeah.
But
well, I'd love to be a part of that. I mean, that's the kind of stuff. Yeah, the word for me is infrastructure. There's not maybe that's not the best word, but there needs to be containers and frameworks and institutional contexts in which these things can move from the realm of people individually becoming aware of these ideas and trying to implement them in their lives to shaping this. And so I'm just, all this is sort of percolating as I'm hearing all this, because I think one of the things that the Hansi books have done and the Metamodern kind of turn has done with some of the integral stuff is really try to apply it really intentionally to political action, political activism, really changing institutions. And it strikes me that a similar move could be done targeting institutional change from the spiritual angle that and I think in many ways a lot of that probably was what the various integral institutions and foundations and frameworks were kind of getting at. And so I'm sure there's a whole conversation to be had there about like, well, what's sort of the current update on the status of all that work and all that. But anyway, I'm really fascinated by all this because I feel like it's very needed, and it could really seem to be potentially, like it could do a lot of the good stuff that needs to happen, for lack of a better way of putting that. Anyway, yeah, I don't know if you have more to say about that topic. Otherwise, we can, yeah.
I'd like your thoughts on that, and that was something that we kind of wrestled with a little bit in putting it together, in that we didn't want to create something that became just another Unitarian Universalist watered down kind of thing. Not to knock Unitarian Universalists too much. They do some beautiful work and there's some wonderful communities.
Mm-hmm.
But I think anyone who's gone very deep in any particular tradition can feel how mostly the surface of those things gets presented in those contexts without a lot of deep rooting.
Yep.
And so we really wanted to find a way that you could do that. What I was calling it at the time was Translineage, where it didn't aim too easily at a single unifying synthesis that then was going to be the new norm, but was a practice. It was more of a praxis of going deep and working between at the same time, for wherever your orientation happened to be.
Mm-hmm.
So, Raimon Panikar, with his notions of topological transformation and homeomorphic equivalence and dialogical dialogue, and he's got a whole lot of concepts that are, I think, provide some useful conceptual architecture for some of that work. But, and then of course, integral theory and metamodernism and others also, I think, have tools. But what do you think about that in terms of the dance between doing something that's deliberately interspiritual, intertraditional, translineage, that doesn't, or unless you think it's a good idea, reduce to a single new articulated creed?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, but it's a very hard thing. So I think there are pitfalls in different ways this could be done. I think that the biggest pitfall of sort of ecumenical and interfaith dialogue has tended to be, all right, we want to really appreciate that there are these very real differences, and we don't want to just, kind of, well, let me rephrase this. Actually, there are even two pitfalls within the ecumenical interfaith dialogue. One of them is there are these very real differences. Actually, I should step back, because historically how this has tended to go is it's been a universalizing tendency to say, oh, okay, well, we'll ignore some of these hyper specific things and we'll just focus on what we all have in common. And then that's a pitfall. And that's sort of more the modernist kind of approach to doing that sort of work. And then there was sort of a postmodern reaction to that and saying, all right, let's really own our particularity. Let's own our specifics and our traditions and not lose any of that. But then the challenge, of course, is how do you, what does a evangelical Christian, Baptist in Tennessee, how can they dialogue with a Tibetan monk, doing extended meditation, right? Like what's going on there that they can share, if it's, you know what I mean? And so then you start focusing so much on the differences that the overlap gets lost. So those are two pitfalls, I think, in some of those, more familiar ways of going about these things. What I like about, I'm calling it tentatively sort of meta religion, which is a kind of abstraction of deep structures and processes that you can recognize different traditions working within or at these different levels, and then be able to say, oh, there's a structural similarity between, what, say, that evangelical Christian is doing in Tennessee to what that Tibetan monk is doing, if they're both thinking more or less mythologically about their experiences and about the narratives of their faith. And then you can start to see, by the way, I'm also not sure if I'm just kind of reinventing the wheel of structuralism here. So I'll probably have to really reassess some of these things as I become more familiar with not just structuralism, but also post-structuralism. But my sense is that, okay, yeah, we can find some real commonalities here, not rooted in content. So the content then is not the specific part. It's not, oh, we all need to agree that Jesus is my personal Lord and Savior, and that's a dogmatic point that's a deep part of the narrative of my faith, and that we agree on this. It's more like, oh, the fact that there is a thing that we need to agree on that's rooted in a narrative is what unites, right, to maybe this other person who Jesus Christ doesn't factor into that, but it's also similarly narrative based and, dogmatic and whatnot. And so I guess the point is that the the benefit of doing it that way is that we can really start to see some real similarities, even where the content isn't the main factor. The downside to that is, I think, what you're saying, which is that then we just have a new narrative, right? Then we have the narrative of spiral dynamics or, integral theory or something, or, the altitudes or whatever. And then it's sort of like, is that, isn't that a problem in some ways? Or in what way will that become parochialized, right? And this is sort of the knife's edge of what I'm trying to figure out right now and need a lot of guidance on, because generally speaking, I think that is the best approach. mindful of the pitfalls, but I feel like if we were to do something there and then take that narrative and then communicate it to people in the different from the different perspectives that they're coming from, maybe even targeting them even specifically tradition based or lineage based, right? So like, having materials that speak to a blue Christian or a blue Buddhist or something like that. And this is where this kind of project could begin to take shape, of doing a meta religious engagement and finding modes of commonality, more in the structures of thought than in the content. And anyway, I could go on and on, but that's sort of like, that's what I'm really intrigued by. And again, could be, no, that's not the greatest way. It could be what's really needed is sort of a mixed bag approach. And maybe all of these things are going to work in different ways. But yeah, that would be my sort of 2-cent or 5-cent answer to that question.
Great. Yeah, I think along similar lines, and I don't know how familiar you are with Raimon Panikar, but that's partly what he means with his notion of homeomorphic equivalence, is that you don't start from the assumption of identity between God, Allah, and Brahman. That's a too easy perennialist move, is to just identify those things. And you don't also have to necessarily presuppose an underlying structure that runs universally through all of them. Instead, you can look at the ecology of the meaning space, and identify what forms serve similar functions in those meaning spaces. Without collapsing them at the level of content or idea, but you look at basically what are the same form, homeomorphic. So you identify those, and those become points of contact and possibility for communication, while not collapsing the thou, the otherness of the thou, into your own language set.
Now, this could be where, either in digging this, like people are like, oh yeah, this is so good. Or people are like, what the heck are they talking about? This is, too far into the weeds, but I'm just going to go there. And, so what I'm curious about is let's say you were to generate, let's just call it materials, because what forms work for different, levels or perspectives, whatever you want to call it, these distinct structures. Or what was the Panikar phrase? Homeomorphic equivalence at those sorts of levels, right? Here's the challenge for me would be, let's say you created, just to use blue, that spiral dynamics sort of, framework for an example. It's mythological, mythic membership, that sort of thing, let's just say. And let's say then that you kind of wrote a kind of mythical text, right? Obviously, this is where a lot of my thoughts have been lately, but I'm starting to kind of bump up against some of the limitations of it, because it's like, let's say you just make a new religious mythic text that speaks to that homeomorphic, structure field. The problem is, right, that the people you'd be trying to speak to with that aren't going to be interested, because they'll just view it as like another alien religion versus what they've already been working with. Right. So if you're a Christian evangelical fundamentalist of some stripe and you're blue and you're just sort of presented with this maybe like more integrative narrative in blue clothing, you're going to, just because it's blue doesn't mean you're just going to gobble it up. You might push it away very vehemently because it's that, right? So what this reveals to me is that this is one of the most important things about working within the specific traditions that exist, rather than maybe trying to focus on this new narrative in its different articulations. It would be more like, no, like the people who are doing the blue thing, they are Christian or Hindu or Buddhist. They're already, they're in a tradition. And so what's more needed is then some way, I guess that's the question, is like, how do those things then across that that structure, how does coherence come about that isn't just sort of let's all jump off of our current blue narrative and switch to this other one that we can all share, right? Because that's not going to happen and probably isn't ideal, right? I mean, it's losing all that particularity and that heritage and all that. So that's kind of one of my hangups with some of this is, and I don't know if you have any thoughts about that issue.
Yeah, it's really hard. And I have to admit that, one of the ways that I've thought about it, I'm afraid of it sounding elitist, and I don't mean it that way, but it seems that's part of what we were aiming at with the Foundation for Integral Religion and Spirituality. We just called it FIRS, so I'll abbreviate it from now on. Kind of a two-pronged thing. One, taking a cue from Roy Bhaskar, where philosophy serves as an underlaborer to science. There's a potential for integrative or metamodern theory to serve as an underlaborer for theology, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not to establish a master over narrative, but to work in ways and be in communication in ways that you can both provide, support and insight, for different communities, and also perform immanent critique within different communities. And because one person or group of people probably can't do that across all of those boundaries, you're not going to have enough of a grasp of the richness. That was the idea really behind making a multiple faith coordination effort, is that to present the tools, in this as tools for underlaboring, and allowing basically then the work to happen uniquely within the traditions by those people who adopt that. So it's definitely not going to be everybody who gets the idea of homeomorphic equivalence, but you don't need everybody to get it. You just need some people within a tradition to get that.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if this is a good example or not, but on the Christian, forums where I used to play a trolling and gadfly role for a number of years, there was a minister there that I regularly engaged with, and he was a thoughtful and broadly read individual and already had done, reading in multiple traditions. So he wasn't just a closed, but in some ways he was very strongly, absolutist about what is actually the true path, and really, I think, was a worthy opponent for me to the, because he was very brilliant and very polite, and very, very committed to an absolutist narrative, even though he was broadly read. And just through the dialogue with him over the years, I would say nothing special that I did necessarily, except just holding open the dialogue, right? And continuing to come back and meet him, that more and more, even though he's remained within his tradition to the degree that he can, an integrative metamodern way of viewing his texts and his communities began to grow. And he had to find, and he actually had ended up having some really powerful mystical experiences, which had never happened in his life before. And so really a ripening happened over about 8 years, right? And it wasn't an easy process. It was more like intensive, dialogical encounter. But to me, it gave me some hope that he didn't lose his rooting in his tradition, but he saw something that really made him want to reach for those tools, and to help people, especially look past the boundaries in any way that those boundaries were creating moral or ethical problems for contributing members in a global community.
Yeah. It's interesting to me. It's how, like, why some people over the years might start from, an absolutistic and maybe more narrow view and yet continue to come back for dialogue and discussion, and might end up in a different place because of it, and why some people don't, like why some people are just closed from the beginning. That to me is a really crucial nut to crack, right? Is that a temperament thing? Is it a is it to what degree is it related to those homeomorphic equivalent structures, and to what degree is it separate from them, right? I mean, because you could say, oh well, a blue, kind of perspective is going to be very ethnocentric and limited, right? But you can develop from blue, and people do, right? And so like what are the causes or the factors, the variables that lead to people getting to not allowing that to unfold, for me is like a crucial element, or just a big open question, I guess. But anyway, these sorts of conversations are for me the most fascinating thing, and like I'm really interested in having more of them. I feel like I'm coming into a space where some of these conversations must have been going on in some degree of intensity, probably for years, if not decades at this point. And I'm sort of like, oh, cool, this is great. And so there's a point at which, one, I don't know how far along certain of these threads or strands in this conversation have already been. It's sort of like, is it like, oh yeah, we've dealt with all that, like, see our thread or forum from 2006 or whatever, or to what degree like this is the live, open, and actually there'd be no one better to ask than you. I mean, where do you feel like these conversations currently kind of stand, if that question makes sense?
It does. I've felt in watching you and watching what you're doing and watching the Metamodern Spirituality Forum, I felt I'm in a way watching myself do exactly the same thing, about a decade or 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean that in a way that says that you're retreading old ground, because the kind of questions that I think you're wrestling with and that I was wrestling with are not easily resolved questions that we just, we summed it up and fixed it, 15 years ago.
Right.
But they're to me, it's in a way validating to see you wrestling with the same questions that we were wrestling with, 15 years ago or 20 years ago, whatever, in that forum. Because we did talk about a lot of the things, and a lot of things that you're opening up in your group from your own lens and with your own background. And I think zeroing in on exactly the same key points that we really felt were essential for moving forward. And no way would I say that, we, in my own personal group, that we arrived at anything that was, was a final answer or anything definitive. But
right.
Definitely we followed some tracks pretty deeply and got to know about a number of, efforts and communities that I think are worth staying in touch with in terms of social experiments. I don't know if you know about like Faith House Manhattan with Samir Salmanovic, and he basically has a church that's a multi-faith church, but it's not a Unitarian Universalist or anything like that. It's open to atheists, it's open to witches. But he started out as a Muslim, converted to something like Jehovah's Witness, and gradually developed into a perspective that embraced Christianity, Judaism, and pagan religions, and atheism, humanism. And so what he's doing in Faith House Manhattan is basically bringing people from multiple faith traditions together to work collaboratively on solving social issues. And so they're doing activist work, they're doing charity work, they're doing all kinds of things. And, I think it's pretty beautiful. And mostly they're speaking in a language that appeals, I think to modern and more to modern and to green than to
Mm.
traditional.
Hmm.
But they welcome in everybody. And, there's, yeah, some beautiful stories about what he's done. Then there's the deep dialogue work of Ashok Gangadine, and there's another um, deep dialogue organization where uh, they have various projects where they bring faith communities into contact with each other and facilitate different encounters. So a few years back, they brought some traditional Arab scholars and had them live in a traditional Mennonite society in the US.
Hmm.
And they were both deeply, religious and scholastically informed people, but they were mostly amber. Um,
Hmm.
and they viewed each other pretty much as enemies. And they engaged in this, several week long depth process of sharing and walking through tensions and learning dialogical practices. And it was a really beautiful outcome. Uh, you know, the the Arab practitioner said, "We never thought among Christians we would find people of such spirit and such heart.
Mm. Hmm.
We'll come back. We will come
Mm.
back to this."
Yeah.
So I think those kinds of real world encounters that, if you talk to the people who are coordinating them, they hold pretty broad translineage perspectives, but they don't put those frameworks on the people they're working with.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
just create the containers.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's been so cool to have more seasoned participants in these deep conversations, like yourself and Layman and others, is um, to get some of the recommendations for these books, and these authors like Panikar and Bhaskar. I have not yet even read them yet, right? So, like, I'm sure that um, as I'm encountering some of this new material, I'll be like, oh, I have a great idea for a book, and I'll start to plan it, and then I'll be like, oh wait, okay, that book was already written and now I can read that. And so that's been both deeply enjoyable and deeply frustrating, but mostly enjoyable, because really where I want to be is, okay, yeah, I want to digest all this and then be like, what more really is needed. And when I mean the way that I look at it sort of is like, yes, none of this has, even if you've been exploring or helping to resolve some of these really profound, important issues, for the past 20 years, it's not really final until the world is transformed. So, like, we'll know that that's happened when you look out and there really is this kind of deep integration and harmony out there. And so I kind of want to find where that bleeding edge is, to then say, all right, where do we take it now from here, so that that's the work ahead. And I find so many, so many people are engaging in this sort of a project in different ways, whether it is this integral or the interfaith, translineage stuff that you're talking about, to John Vervaeke's Religion That's Not a Religion, to Jamie Wheel, to there's sort of this attempt of like, all right, we know what the problems are. We know how urgently we need to seek resolution and seek a solution that will help heal these problems. And we recognize how important a spiritual component is at the root of all this. And to some degree, let's do some kind of a back engineering or reverse engineering project to like come up with something that can bring all this together. And it's sort of like, that's where it's at, but it's sort of like, all right, that's an articulation of the project, but where does all that land? How does all that shake out? And so I'm really interested in the whole thing. And I'm, for the first time, really, again, over the past maybe just couple of years, feel like I'm finally finding those people asking those questions. Because I don't know, not maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I would start to come out and I'd ask people about these sorts of things or say what I was doing. And everyone was like, oh, Brennan, you're starting a cult? Like, what do oh, you're trying to start a new religion. You're trying to what? Like, and there, but yeah, now I'm finding that no, there really is a deep understanding of what this sort of thing is about. And that's both just really encouraging, but also really exciting, because, I feel like this is the good stuff. Bruce, this has been great. I thank you so much. Again, your work is there's uh I don't know how to put it in a way that will best communicate what I'm trying to say. It's something like there are like elders, in the best sense of people who have a deep sense of wisdom. Age, not necessarily a crucial component of that, but just repositories of great experience and great wisdom. And the work that you're doing and that Layman's doing and that a bunch of other people are doing in these spaces is like, there are just certain folks, and I'm like, it's very enriching, and it's very always illuminating. So thank you very much for the stuff that you're putting out, and greatly appreciate it, and greatly appreciate the opportunity to get into it, and we'll get into it again soon, it sounds like.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I'm excited by the work you're doing. I'm excited that you have a retreat center. I want to come there someday. So look forward to that.
For sure. For sure. More on that to come. Take care, my friend.
You too. Take care.